The sound of shattering glass cut through the quiet afternoon like a scream no one could ignore. A car had spun out of control just outside the roadside motel, its front crushed against a rusted signboard, smoke curling into the bright daylight sky. People watched from a distance, frozen, uncertain, unwilling to step closer. But one man didn't hesitate. Aariz Qureshi ran toward the wreck without thinking. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of unexpected heroes, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Echoes of Stories. Your support keeps these stories alive. Aariz wasn't someone the world paid attention to. At 29, his life had settled into a quiet pattern of survival. He worked at a small, nearly forgotten garage on the outskirts of the city, where the paint peeled off the walls and the tools were older than most of the cars he repaired. His hands were always stained with grease, his clothes worn thin, and his pockets almost always empty. Every rupee he earned went toward paying off debts left behind by his late father, who had spent years trying, and failing, to keep the same garage alive. Life had not been kind to Aariz, but it had made him resilient. That afternoon, he had been passing by the motel after delivering a repaired motorbike when the accident happened. Without stopping to consider the danger, he rushed forward. The car door was jammed, the engine still hissing angrily, threatening to burst into flames at any moment. Inside, a young woman lay slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Her fingers trembled faintly, as if clinging to the last thread of consciousness. Aariz didn't think about the risk. He grabbed a metal rod from nearby debris and forced the door open with sheer determination. It groaned, resisted, then finally gave way. He pulled the woman out carefully, lifting her away from the wreck just as a small burst of fire flickered under the hood. He carried her to safety, laying her gently on the dusty ground. His heart pounded wildly as he checked her pulse. It was weak, but it was there. Someone called an ambulance. Someone else recorded the scene on their phone. But Aariz stayed by her side, shielding her face from the harsh sunlight with his worn-out jacket. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. All he knew was that she needed help, and he wasn't about to walk away. Hours later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Aariz found himself sitting outside the same motel, his hands still trembling slightly. The woman had been taken to the hospital, and life around him had already started returning to normal. Cars passed. People resumed their routines. The world moved on. But something inside him had shifted. The motel manager, a stern man who rarely showed emotion, approached him and handed him a small envelope. Inside was a modest amount of cash, barely enough to cover a day's meals. It was meant as gratitude. Aariz accepted it with a quiet nod, though something about it felt incomplete. He hadn't helped for money. He had helped because it was the right thing to do. Days passed. Aariz returned to his routine, fixing engines, negotiating with customers who always wanted to pay less, and stretching every rupee as far as it would go. But the memory of that afternoon stayed with him, the sound of the crash, the fragile pulse beneath his fingers, the way the woman's life had hung in the balance. He wondered if she had survived. At the same time, life seemed determined to test him further. The garage owner, an aging man named Karim, announced that he might have to shut down the business. Debts were piling up, and customers were becoming fewer. Aariz's already unstable life teetered on the edge of collapse. For the first time in years, he felt fear creeping in. Then, one morning, everything changed. A sleek black car pulled up outside the garage, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun. It didn't belong in a place like this. People slowed down to stare. From the car stepped a well-dressed man, followed by a woman Aariz recognized instantly. It was her. She looked different now, healthier, composed, her forehead wrapped in a faint, healing scar. But her eyes were the same. She walked toward Aariz with quiet determination. Her name was Meher Ayaan. She worked as a receptionist at that roadside motel, or at least, that's what Aariz had believed. In reality, she was far more than that. Meher was the daughter of the founder of a nationwide hospitality company, a business empire that owned not just the motel, but dozens of hotels across the country. But she hadn't told anyone. She had chosen to work quietly, observing, learning, understanding the struggles of ordinary employees without revealing her identity. And on that ordinary day, her life had nearly ended. Meher stood in front of Aariz, her gaze steady but filled with something deeper, gratitude, respect, and a quiet kind of admiration. She told him that the doctors had said she wouldn't have survived if he hadn't acted when he did. Those few minutes had made all the difference. Aariz listened, unsure how to respond. He shifted uncomfortably, wiping his hands on a rag. He hadn't expected any of this. Meher then did something that surprised everyone present. She asked him a question. Not about the accident. Not about his life. But about his dreams. At first, Aariz didn't understand. Dreams were a luxury he had long abandoned. His world revolved around survival, not ambition. But Meher insisted. Slowly, hesitantly, he spoke. He talked about his father's garage, about the dream of turning it into something bigger, a proper workshop with modern tools, fair wages, and honest work. A place where people like him wouldn't have to struggle every day just to stay afloat. He had buried that dream years ago. Meher listened carefully. And then she made him an offer. Not charity. Not a handout. An opportunity. Her company was expanding, and they needed skilled, trustworthy people to manage vehicle maintenance for their growing fleet. She wanted Aariz to lead a new division, starting small, but with the potential to grow. It was more than a job. It was a chance to rebuild his dream. Aariz was stunned. Part of him wanted to refuse. Pride, doubt, fear, they all held him back. He wasn't used to being given chances. Life had taught him to expect disappointment, not opportunity. But another part of him, the part that had run toward a burning car without hesitation, whispered that this was his moment. He accepted. The weeks that followed were not easy. Aariz faced challenges at every step. Managing people, handling finances, learning systems he had never used before, it all felt overwhelming. There were moments when he thought he would fail, when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy to carry. But Meher didn't abandon him. She guided him, supported him, believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Slowly, things began to change. The small division grew. The garage transformed. New equipment replaced old tools. Workers who had once struggled alongside Aariz found stability, respect, and fair wages. And Aariz, once a broke mechanic with nothing but calloused hands, became a leader. Not because he was perfect. But because he understood struggle. Years later, the same roadside motel stood brighter, busier, part of a thriving network. Aariz often visited, not as a passerby, but as someone who had become part of something bigger. He would sometimes stand near the spot where the accident had happened, remembering that day. Remembering how everything had changed in a single moment. Meher, now actively leading her father's company, never forgot either. She often said that the company's greatest success wasn't measured in profits or expansion, but in the lives it touched and transformed. And Aariz was proof of that. Before this story ends, take a moment to share in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment where one act of kindness changed everything? Your story might inspire someone else today. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a mechanic and a receptionist. It was a story about courage in ordinary moments. About choosing to help when it's easier to walk away. About how one selfless act can ripple through lives in ways we can't imagine. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Stories. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. And remember, sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever, including your own.